My name is Beverly, and I'm 32 years old. Sitting in that sterile courtroom, watching my soon-to-be ex-husband Marcus whisper confidently with his lawyer, I felt my stomach twist into knots. 5 years of marriage were about to be dissected like a business transaction. Our love story had started at a charity gala in downtown Chicago, but it ended with his affair with my former business partner and best friend. Marcus sat there with that familiar smug expression, the same one he wore when he thought he had all the angles figured out. He believed our prenuptial agreement would protect his music production company while entitling him to half of everything I'd built. What he didn't realize was that our prenup contained a clause that would shatter his confidence in the next hour. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the truth finally comes to light. 5 years earlier, I met Marcus at a charity gala for children's literacy in downtown Chicago. I was 27, then a self-made real estate developer who had clawed her way up from nothing. Growing up in a working-class family in Dayton, Ohio, I watched my parents struggle to make ends meet. My father worked double shifts at the auto plant, while my mother cleaned office buildings at night. I promised myself I'd never depend on anyone else for financial security. By the time I met Marcus, I had already completed my first commercial development project and was planning my second. The gala was held at the Four Seasons, and I was there more for networking than charity, if I'm being honest. Then I saw him across the room, talking animatedly with a group of people near the auction tables. Marcus had this magnetic energy that drew people in. He was tall with dark hair that always looked perfectly tousled, as if he'd just run his fingers through it. When he laughed, his whole face lit up. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours. We talked about everything from urban development to his dreams of revolutionizing the music industry through his production company. He understood my ambition in a way that most men didn't. While other guys seemed intimidated by my success, Marcus was genuinely interested in my projects. He asked thoughtful questions about zoning laws and construction timelines. More importantly, he never once suggested I should slow down or prioritize relationships over career. Our romance unfolded like something from a movie. Weekend trips to Napa Valley, where we'd taste wine and plan our future. Late-night conversations on my apartment balcony overlooking the lake, talking about the empire we'd build together. Marcus would bring his guitar and play songs he'd written, some of them inspired by our relationship. I felt like I'd found my perfect partner, someone who matched my drive and ambition. 8 months later, he proposed at our favorite restaurant, Alinea, with a view of Lake Michigan. The ring was beautiful, a vintage Art Deco design that somehow perfectly captured my personality. As he got down on one knee, I remember thinking that this was what happiness felt like. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Planning the wedding brought up the question of a prenuptial agreement. My lawyer, Margaret Sullivan, strongly recommended one. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who had built her reputation protecting high-net-worth individuals in family law cases. Margaret insisted that anyone with significant assets should protect themselves regardless of how much they trusted their partner. Marcus initially resisted the idea. He said it showed a lack of faith in our relationship, that planning for divorce while planning a wedding seemed contradictory. But I explained that it wasn't about trust. It was about being practical. Business partnerships have contracts, and marriage was in many ways a business partnership too. The negotiations took several weeks. My primary concern was protecting my real estate business and the properties I owned before marriage. Marcus wanted to ensure his music production company remained separate property as well. We agreed that any assets we acquired together during marriage would be split equally, but our individual businesses would remain our own. That's when Margaret insisted on including what she called a fidelity clause. She explained that many high-net-worth individuals were adding these provisions to protect themselves from spouses who might be motivated by money rather than love. The clause stated that any spouse found guilty of adultery would forfeit all claims to marital assets and would owe substantial damages to the betrayed party. Marcus seemed uncomfortable with this provision, but Margaret was firm. She said it protected both of us equally and would only matter if one of us chose to break our marriage vows. Eventually, he agreed, and we both signed the document 2 weeks before our wedding. Our wedding day was perfect. 200 guests gathered at the Chicago Botanic Garden on a sunny September afternoon. My father, usually uncomfortable in formal settings, beamed with pride as he walked me down the aisle. Marcus looked handsome in his tailored tuxedo, and when he saw me, tears filled his eyes. During our vows, he promised to support my dreams and build a life worthy of our love. The early years of our marriage were everything I'd hoped for. We bought a beautiful house in Lincoln Park, a Victorian-era home that we renovated together. Marcus turned the 3rd floor into a music studio while I converted the basement into a home office. We talked about having children, about the family vacations we'd take, about growing old together. My business continued to thrive. I completed 2 major commercial developments and began expanding into residential luxury projects. Marcus's production company had some ups and downs, but he was passionate about his work, and I supported him through the challenging periods. We were a team, or so I thought. I never imagined I'd need that fidelity clause, but my lawyer was wiser than I knew. By our 3rd year of marriage, cracks began to show in what I thought was our perfect foundation. Marcus's music production company was struggling more than he'd initially admitted. While my business was experiencing unprecedented growth with 3 major commercial developments and an expansion into the residential luxury market, his company was hemorrhaging money. I didn't mind supporting us financially. Success in business often comes in waves, and I assumed Marcus's turn would come. What bothered me was how he began to change. The man who once celebrated my victories started to seem resentful of them. He'd make subtle comments about my long hours, suggesting that my dedication to work was affecting our marriage. The late nights became more frequent. Marcus claimed he was working on new projects, meeting with potential clients, trying to turn his company around. I wanted to be supportive, so I didn't question it when he'd come home at 2 in the morning, smelling like expensive perfume, and claiming he'd been at industry networking events. Around this time, I decided to bring in a business partner to help manage my growing real estate empire. Diane Richardson had been my roommate at Northwestern University, where we both studied architecture. She was brilliant, creative, and understood my vision for sustainable urban development. More importantly, I trusted her completely. We'd maintained our friendship through college and beyond, and when I offered her a partnership in my firm, she accepted immediately. Diane was everything I wasn't in business. Where I was direct and sometimes blunt, she was diplomatic and charming. She could schmooze clients at cocktail parties, while I preferred to let the numbers speak for themselves. Together, we made an incredible team. Our first joint project, a mixed-use development in River North, exceeded all expectations. What I didn't realize at the time was how much attention Marcus was paying to Diane. At first, their interactions seemed natural. She was my business partner, so of course she'd be around our house frequently. They'd chat about music, art, and culture, while I reviewed contracts or returned phone calls. Marcus had always been social, and I appreciated that he made Diane feel welcome in our home. The business meetings between Marcus and Diane started innocently enough. She mentioned that some of her architectural clients might need music for promotional videos or presentations. Marcus was excited about the potential crossover between our businesses. What began as occasional coffee meetings evolved into regular dinner appointments that stretched late into the evening. I started noticing small changes in Marcus's behavior. He'd shower immediately when he came home, claiming he'd been at the gym. His phone, which used to sit openly on our kitchen counter, was now always face down and within arm's reach. When I'd walk into a room while he was texting, he'd quickly put the phone away and give me his full attention, which somehow felt more suspicious than reassuring. The credit card statements revealed unexplained charges at expensive restaurants I'd never been to. When I asked about them, Marcus claimed they were business expenses meetings with potential clients or investors. He'd grown defensive about his finances, saying that my success didn't give me the right to micromanage his spending. I tried to address my growing concerns through conversation. I suggested we plan romantic getaways, just the two of us away from work and distractions. Marcus agreed, but even during our weekend in Door County, he seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone and making excuses to step away for important calls. When I suggested couples therapy, Marcus initially resisted. He said our problems weren't serious enough to require professional help, that we just needed to communicate better. Eventually, he agreed to go, but the sessions felt performative. He'd say all the right things to the therapist, while I sat there feeling like I was going crazy, seeing problems that apparently only existed in my imagination. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, our therapist, was kind, but direct. She encouraged us to have honest conversations about our expectations and fears. During one session, she asked Marcus directly if there was anything he needed to tell me. The way he shifted in his chair and avoided eye contact made my stomach drop. But he assured both of us that he was committed to our marriage. The gaslighting became more sophisticated. When I expressed concerns about his late nights or secretive behavior, Marcus would turn the conversation back to my work habits. He'd say I was projecting my own guilt about long hours onto him, that my obsession with success was making me paranoid and suspicious. He painted himself as the neglected husband of a workaholic wife. Looking back, I can see how calculated it all was. Marcus was laying the groundwork for what would later become his divorce strategy. By characterizing me as someone who prioritized business over marriage, he was building a case that he'd been the supportive spouse who deserved compensation for his sacrifices. The night I discovered the truth, I'd returned early from a business trip to Minneapolis. A potential client had canceled our morning meeting, so instead of staying overnight as planned, I caught a late flight home. I wanted to surprise Marcus, maybe salvage some intimacy in our struggling marriage. I found them in our bed tangled in sheets I'd bought for our second anniversary. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment I couldn't process what I was seeing. Marcus scrambled to explain, claiming it wasn't what it looked like, that they'd been drinking and made a mistake. But the way they looked at each other, the comfort with which Diane reached for her clothes, told me this wasn't their first time. Diane, my best friend since college, the woman I'd trusted with my business and my home, couldn't even meet my eyes. She mumbled something about not meaning for it to happen, about how complicated feelings had developed over time. Her betrayal cut deeper than Marcus's because I'd chosen to trust her with my livelihood, not just my heart. The confrontation that followed was ugly and raw. Through tears and screaming, the truth emerged. Their affair had been going on for 6 months. Those business dinners, those late-night meetings, those weekend consultations had all been elaborate covers for their relationship. They'd been laughing about my oblivious trust, planning their future while destroying mine. Marcus tried to minimize what had happened, calling it a mistake, saying he still loved me and wanted to work things out. But I could see in his eyes that he was already calculating his next moves. Even in the moment of being caught, he was planning his exit strategy. I filed for divorce the next morning. Marcus moved out within a week, taking only his personal belongings and his music equipment. But I could tell from his demeanor that he wasn't devastated by the end of our marriage. If anything, he seemed relieved, as if I'd given him permission to pursue what he really wanted. I thought I'd lost everything, but I had no idea the real battle was just beginning. The full scope of Marcus and Diane's betrayal became clear in the weeks following my discovery. Their affair hadn't been a spontaneous mistake or an emotional entanglement that spiraled out of control. It was a calculated deception that extended far beyond personal betrayal into business espionage and financial manipulation. Diane had been using her position as my business partner to gather information about my personal finances, my business strategies, and my future projects. She'd accessed files she had no business reviewing, copied financial documents, and shared confidential information with Marcus. Together, they'd been planning not just to continue their relationship, but to use the divorce settlement to fund their own competing architectural and entertainment development firm. The evidence of their conspiracy emerged gradually. I found emails on our shared business server where Diane had forwarded my project proposals to an external address. When I traced that address, it led to a limited liability company that Marcus and Diane had registered 3 months earlier. They'd already secured office space in River North and were preparing to poach my clients. Marcus's transformation from loving husband to calculating adversary was swift and complete. Within 2 weeks of moving out, he'd hired Harold Brennan, one of Chicago's most aggressive divorce attorneys. Brennan was known for his scorched earth tactics in high-net-worth divorces, and his fee structure suggested that Marcus was confident about his potential settlement. The first settlement meeting took place in Brennan's corner office on LaSalle Street. The conference room overlooked the Chicago River, and Harold had clearly chosen the intimidating setting deliberately. Marcus sat beside his lawyer with a confidence that seemed completely disconnected from reality. This was the same man who'd been struggling to keep his music production company afloat, who'd contributed virtually nothing to our household income in the past 2 years. Harold's opening statement was breathtakingly audacious. He demanded 50% of all marital assets, including my business, my personal real estate holdings, and my investment portfolio. According to his calculations, Marcus was entitled to over $8 million in assets and ongoing spousal support of $15,000 per month. The inventory of my assets was both accurate and infuriating. My real estate holdings included 4 commercial properties valued at $12 million. My 50% stake in the architectural firm, worth approximately $3 million, and an investment portfolio worth $2 million. Our family home in Lincoln Park was appraised at $1.8 million. I'd also accumulated various other assets, artwork, jewelry, and a small vacation condo in Wisconsin. Marcus's assets, by contrast, were negligible. His music production company was worth perhaps $200,000, and that was being generous. He had some recording equipment, a few instruments, and mounting business debts. The disparity was so obvious that I couldn't understand how any reasonable person could justify his demands. But Harold's strategy wasn't based on equal contribution. It was based on emotional manipulation and legal technicalities. He argued that Marcus had been the supportive spouse who'd sacrificed his own career advancement to help me build my business empire. According to their narrative, Marcus had handled all our social obligations, entertained my clients, and provided the emotional support that enabled my professional success. The investigation into my business practices was invasive and humiliating. Harold hired forensic accountants to examine 5 years of financial records, looking for any evidence that Marcus had contributed to my business growth. They scrutinized every client dinner, every networking event, every business trip, trying to quantify Marcus's alleged contributions. The media attention was the worst part. Chicago's business journals picked up the story of the high-profile divorce, and suddenly, my personal life was being dissected in trade publications. The headlines were sensationalized and unfair: real estate mogul's marriage crumbles over work obsession, and the price of success when business destroys love. Marcus seemed to relish the attention. He gave interviews portraying himself as the victim of a workaholic wife who'd prioritized money over marriage. He described lonely evenings waiting for me to come home, canceled vacation plans, and birthday dinners interrupted by business calls. Some of his claims had kernels of truth, which made them more effective as weapons. My mother, who'd always adored Marcus, struggled to understand how our marriage had failed so completely. She'd call crying, asking what she could have done differently, wondering if she'd failed to teach me how to balance career and family. Her disappointment added another layer of guilt to my already overwhelming emotional burden. My sister Janet flew in from California to support me through the proceedings. She was furious about Marcus's betrayal and Diane's involvement. but her anger somehow made me feel more isolated. Everyone around me was reacting with appropriate outrage, while I felt numb, exhausted by the constant legal battles and public scrutiny. The emotional toll was devastating. I lost 15 pounds in 6 weeks, barely sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours per night. My appetite disappeared, and I survived mostly on coffee and the occasional protein bar. My business partners expressed concern about my health, but I pushed through knowing that appearing weak would only strengthen Marcus's case. Diane's betrayal continued to deepen the wound. She was using her inside knowledge of my business vulnerabilities to help Harold build his case. She provided detailed information about my work habits, my client relationships, and my decision-making processes. Her intimate knowledge of my personality and business methods became weapons in Marcus's arsenal. The most painful aspect was watching Marcus and Diane's relationship become increasingly public. They were photographed at expensive restaurants, vacation resorts in Miami, and cultural events around Chicago. The same man who'd claimed poverty in our divorce proceedings was apparently flush enough to fund an extravagant lifestyle with his new girlfriend. As the hearing date approached, I felt like David facing Goliath, but I had one weapon they didn't know about. The morning of the divorce hearing arrived gray and cold, typical for Chicago in late November. I barely managed to choke down half a piece of toast and some coffee, my stomach churning with anxiety and anticipation. After months of preparation, depositions, and legal maneuvering, everything would be decided in a single day. Margaret Sullivan, my attorney, had been a calming presence throughout this nightmare. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and steel-gray eyes that missed nothing. Her reputation in family law was impeccable, built on 30 years of protecting clients' interests with methodical precision. While Harold Brennan relied on dramatic flourishes and emotional manipulation, Margaret preferred facts, precedent, and careful preparation. The Cook County Courthouse was crawling with media when we arrived. Photographers snapped pictures as I walked up the steps in my navy blue suit, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Inside, the corridors buzzed with lawyers, clerks, and other people navigating the legal system. The whole atmosphere felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Judge Patricia Coleman presided over our case. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and her impatience with theatrical legal tactics. Her courtroom was formal and intimidating, with dark wood paneling and high ceilings that seemed to amplify every sound. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, acutely aware of Marcus sitting 20 feet away with his legal team. Marcus looked confident, almost cocky, in his expensive designer suit. He'd clearly invested in his appearance for this performance, and he kept flashing that familiar, charming smile whenever he thought the judge might be looking. His body language radiated entitlement, as if he genuinely believed he deserved half of everything I'd worked to build. Harold Brennan's opening statement was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. He painted Marcus as the devoted husband who'd sacrificed his own career aspirations to support my ambitions. According to Harold's narrative, Marcus had been the wind beneath my wings, the emotional foundation that enabled my professional success. "Your Honor," Harold began, his voice rich with practiced sincerity. "My client spent 5 years of his life building up not just a marriage, but a partnership that enabled Beverly Richardson to become one of Chicago's most successful real estate developers. While she was closing deals and expanding her business empire, Marcus Richardson was maintaining their home, managing their social obligations, and providing the emotional support that every successful entrepreneur requires." The testimony that followed was carefully crafted fiction based on selective facts. Harold presented evidence of Marcus's involvement in my business life: photographs from client events, testimonials from friends about his supportive nature, and documentation of social gatherings where he'd allegedly helped me network and build relationships. When Marcus took the stand, his performance was Oscar-worthy. He described feeling abandoned and neglected, working late into the night on his own struggling business, while waiting for me to come home from yet another business meeting. He talked about canceled anniversaries, postponed vacations, and birthday celebrations interrupted by urgent phone calls. I understood that Beverly's work was important, he said, his voice breaking slightly. But I thought our marriage was important too. I kept thinking that if I just supported her enough, if I was patient enough, we'd eventually find balance. Instead, I watched the woman I loved disappear into her work until there was nothing left of us. The most infuriating part was how he managed to weave truth into his lies. Yes, I had worked long hours. Yes, I had sometimes prioritized business over personal time, but he conveniently omitted his own choices, his own betrayals, and his own lack of contribution to our household or our future. Harold's strategy became clear as the testimony continued. He argued that the prenuptial agreement had been signed under duress, that my business success had come primarily after our marriage, and that Marcus's emotional and social contributions had been essential to that success. He demanded not just half of our marital assets, but half of my business ongoing spousal support and damages for what he characterized as emotional abandonment. The dollar amounts were staggering. Marcus was seeking approximately $6 million in assets plus monthly spousal support of $15,000. Harold presented this demand with a straight face, as if a man who'd contributed virtually nothing financially to our marriage deserved to walk away with half of everything I'd built. When it was my turn to testify, I tried to remain composed while defending my life's work. I explained how I'd built my business from nothing, how every deal and every success had come from my own efforts, knowledge, and risk-taking. I acknowledged that marriage required compromise, but I rejected the characterization of myself as a cold, calculating woman who'd used her husband as an emotional support system. Harold's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned every aspect of my work habits, my priorities, and my commitment to our marriage. He made me recount specific instances where business had interfered with personal plans, forcing me to defend decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but sounded callous when presented without context. "Ms. Richardson," Harold asked with mock concern, "can you tell the court how many times in your 5-year marriage you canceled personal plans to handle business matters?" The question was impossible to answer accurately, and Harold knew it. Any number I gave would either sound defensive or damaging. I tried to explain that entrepreneurship requires flexibility and that Marcus had initially supported my dedication, but Harold cut me off, moving to his next attack. Judge Coleman asked probing questions about the validity of our prenuptial agreement, the timeline of my business growth, and the specific contributions Marcus might have made. Her questions seemed fair but thorough, and I couldn't read her thoughts from her expression. Margaret's defense was methodical and fact-based. She presented documentation of my business success, both before and after marriage financial records showing Marcus's minimal contributions and evidence of my independent work and decision-making. But I could see that the emotional narrative Harold had constructed was having an impact. During the lunch recess, I broke down in the courthouse bathroom, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. 5 years of marriage, 10 years of friendship with Diane, and 15 years of building my career were all being dissected and redistributed based on lies and manipulation. Margaret found me there and offered the first reassurance I'd felt in months. "Trust me," she said quietly. "We have something they don't expect." The afternoon session continued with Harold's closing arguments. He was passionate and persuasive, painting Marcus as a victim of modern society's obsession with career success at the expense of human relationships. He argued that Marcus deserved compensation, not just for his direct contributions, but for the opportunities he'd sacrificed to support my ambitions. As I watched Harold's performance, I felt everything slipping away. Judge Coleman seemed to be listening carefully to his arguments, and I could see Marcus's confidence growing with every passing minute. He actually smirked at me during Harold's closing, a look of triumph that made my blood boil. The man who'd betrayed me, lied to me, and conspired against me was about to walk away with half of everything I'd worked for. The injustice was so complete, so overwhelming, that I felt physically sick. Then Margaret stood up, and I saw a look in her eyes that gave me the first hope I'd felt in months. Margaret's request to approach the bench seemed routine at first. She carried a slim folder in her hand as she walked toward Judge Coleman, her movements deliberate and calm. Harold looked slightly puzzled, but not concerned as he joined her at the bench for what appeared to be a standard procedural discussion. "Your Honor," Margaret said in her measured tone, "I'd like to present additional evidence that directly relates to the enforceability of the prenuptial agreement in question." Harold's confusion was evident as Margaret opened her folder and removed the original prenuptial agreement. "We've already reviewed this document extensively, Your Honor. I'm not sure what new information counsel believes she can present." Margaret's response was delivered with the precision of a surgeon making a critical incision. "Mr. Brennan, I don't believe you've reviewed this document as thoroughly as you think. Specifically, I'd like to draw the court's attention to Section 15, subsection C." I watched Marcus's face as Margaret began to read aloud from the document. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly that I thought he might faint. Harold frantically flipped through his copy of the prenup, clearly searching for the section Margaret was referencing. "The fidelity clause states," Margaret continued, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "that any spouse found to have committed adultery during the marriage shall forfeit all claims to marital assets and shall be liable for damages to the injured party in the amount of $500,000. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Harold's objection came immediately, his voice sharp with panic. "Your Honor, this clause is unconscionable and unenforceable. It constitutes a penalty provision that violates public policy." But Judge Coleman was already leaning forward, her interest clearly piqued. "Counselor Sullivan, do you have precedent for the enforcement of such clauses in Illinois?" Margaret was ready. "Yes, Your Honor. I have 3 recent cases where similar fidelity clauses were upheld by Illinois courts." She handed a stack of documents to the clerk. "Morrison v. Morrison, 2018, Chen v. Chen, 2019, and Rodriguez v. Rodriguez, 2020. In each case, the Illinois Court of Appeals held that fidelity clauses are enforceable when they are clearly written, mutually agreed upon, and not unconscionable in their application." Harold was scrambling now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Your Honor, even if such clauses can be enforceable in theory, there's no evidence that my client committed adultery." That's when Margaret smiled for the first time all day. "Actually, Mr. Brennan, there's substantial evidence of adultery, evidence that I'm prepared to present to this court right now." What followed was the systematic destruction of Marcus's case piece by carefully documented piece. Margaret had hired a private investigator 3 months before I filed for divorce, acting on her professional instinct that something wasn't right in my marriage. The investigator, a former Chicago police detective named Robert Chen, had been thorough and methodical in documenting Marcus's affair. The evidence was overwhelming. 37 documented instances of Marcus and Diane together in compromising situations. Hotel receipts from the Palmer house showing Marcus had rented rooms on afternoons when he claimed to be working. Credit card statements for expensive dinners at romantic restaurants where he'd taken Diane while telling me he was meeting potential clients. The photographs were particularly damning. Marcus and Diane entering hotel rooms together, kissing in the parking lot of a restaurant in Naperville, walking hand in hand through Lincoln Park Zoo on a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus had told me he was in meetings all day. But Margaret had more than just evidence of the affair. She'd uncovered the broader conspiracy between Marcus and Diane to defraud me of both my personal and business assets. The limited liability company they'd registered together, the office space they'd leased, the client lists they'd copied from my business files. "Your Honor," Margaret continued, "this wasn't simply an extramarital affair. This was a calculated conspiracy to defraud my client of her business assets while using the divorce proceedings to claim half of her personal wealth." The witness testimony that followed was devastating. Hotel staff members identified Marcus and Diane from photographs. Restaurant employees confirmed they'd been regular customers, always paying cash. always requesting private booths. Even the office building manager where they'd leased space testified about their plans to start a competing firm. Marcus's attempts to deny the evidence were pathetic. He claimed the photographs were taken out of context, that his meetings with Diane were purely professional. But when Margaret produced hotel keycard records showing he'd accessed rooms during business hours, his explanations became increasingly desperate. Harold tried valiantly to discredit the evidence questioning the investigator's methods and the chain of custody for the photographs. But Robert Chen was an experienced witness who calmly explained his procedures and documentation. Every piece of evidence had been properly collected and preserved. Judge Coleman's patience with Harold's objections was clearly wearing thin. When he tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, she cut him off. "Mr. Brennan, I've seen hotel receipts, photographs, witness testimony, and business documents. This is hardly circumstantial evidence." But Margaret's coup de grace was yet to come. She produced a recording device and asked permission to play an audio file for the court. "Your Honor, this is a phone conversation between the defendant and Diane Richardson recorded 3 weeks ago with appropriate legal authority." The voices that filled the courtroom were unmistakably Marcus and Diane's. They were discussing their strategy for the divorce, laughing about how much money they'd have once Marcus received his settlement. But more damaging than their financial planning was Marcus's casual cruelty in describing me. "Beverly's so focused on her precious business empire that she has no idea what's coming," Marcus's recorded voice said. "She actually thinks I'm going to walk away with nothing. Harold says we should get at least $4 million, maybe more, if we can prove emotional distress." Diane's laughter was audible on the recording. "She's always been so cold and calculating. It'll be poetic justice when her obsession with money costs her half of it." The recording continued for several more minutes with Marcus and Diane discussing which of my clients they planned to steal, how they'd use the divorce settlement to fund their new business, and their contempt for what they saw as my emotional limitations. The impact on the courtroom was immediate and profound. I watched Marcus sink lower in his chair with each passing second, his face pale and his hands trembling. Harold had stopped taking notes and was staring at his client with what looked like disgust. Judge Coleman's expression had hardened as she listened to the recording. When it ended, she looked directly at Marcus with obvious disapproval. "Mr. Richardson, do you have any response to this evidence?" Marcus's attempted response was incoherent, a jumbled mixture of denials and excuses that convinced no one. He claimed the recording was taken out of context, that his words had been misunderstood, that his relationship with Diane had been mischaracterized, but the damage was complete. The man who thought he'd outsmarted me was about to learn the cost of betrayal. Judge Coleman took a brief recess to review the evidence and consider the legal precedents Margaret had cited. The 20 minutes felt like hours as I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, watching Marcus pace frantically while whispering urgently with Harold. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of panic that comes from realizing your entire strategy has backfired. When court reconvened, Judge Coleman's demeanor was all business. She'd clearly spent the recess researching the enforceability of fidelity clauses and reviewing the evidence Margaret had presented. Her first words confirmed what I'd hardly dared to hope. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented and review of relevant Illinois case law, this court finds that the fidelity clause in the prenuptial agreement between Beverly Richardson and Marcus Richardson is valid, enforceable, and applicable to the facts of this case." Harold made one last desperate attempt to salvage his client's position. "Your Honor, I respectfully request that the court consider the broader context of this marriage. Even if technical adultery occurred, my client's contributions to the marriage and to Mrs. Richardson's business success warrant some consideration." Judge Coleman's response was swift and definitive. "Mr. Brennan, your client didn't commit technical adultery. He engaged in a 6-month affair while simultaneously conspiring to defraud his wife of business assets and planning to use divorce proceeds to fund a competing enterprise with his mistress. The court finds this behavior to be not only a clear violation of the fidelity clause, but also evidence of bad faith that precludes any claim to marital assets. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and devastating for Marcus. Not only would he receive nothing from our divorce, but he was ordered to pay me $500,000 in damages as specified in the prenuptial agreement. Additionally, Judge Coleman ruled that his conspiracy with Diane to steal business assets warranted further legal action. Mr. Richardson, the judge continued, you will have no claim to any marital assets, no right to spousal support, and you will be responsible for your own legal fees in this matter. Furthermore, this court recommends that Mrs. Richardson pursue civil remedies for the business interference and conspiracy that has been documented here today. Harold's shell-shocked expression told the whole story. His aggressive strategy had not only failed completely, but had resulted in his client owing me money instead of receiving it. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, apparently unable to process the complete reversal of his fortunes. The media reaction was immediate and intense. Reporters who had been covering the divorce as a story about a successful woman's failed marriage suddenly had a much more compelling narrative about justice served and comeuppance delivered. As we left the courthouse, photographers captured my confident stride, while Marcus skulked behind his lawyer, trying to avoid the cameras. The business implications extended far beyond the divorce settlement. Diane's role in the conspiracy made her liable for corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and interference with business relationships. Within a week of the court ruling, I had filed civil suits against both her and Marcus for damages to my business. The architectural community in Chicago is relatively small, and word of Diane's betrayal spread quickly. Clients who had worked with our firm distanced themselves from any projects associated with her. The professional relationships she'd spent years building evaporated almost overnight as news of her conspiracy became public knowledge. Margaret's satisfaction with the outcome was evident, though she was too professional to gloat. This is why we include fidelity clauses, she told me as we reviewed the final paperwork. They protect good people from bad actors who see marriage as a business opportunity rather than a personal commitment. Marcus's attempts to appeal the ruling were futile. Harold advised him that the evidence was overwhelming and the legal precedent was clear. The fidelity clause had been properly executed, the adultery was thoroughly documented, and the conspiracy evidence only strengthened the case for enforcement. The financial impact on Marcus was severe. Not only did he lose any claim to marital assets, but the $500,000 judgment threatened to bankrupt him. His struggling music production company couldn't generate anywhere near that kind of money, and his personal assets were minimal. Within a month of the divorce being finalized, Marcus had moved back to his parents' house in Wisconsin. The man who had confidently demanded half of my wealth was now living in his childhood bedroom, trying to figure out how to pay a judgment that represented more money than he'd ever seen in his life. Diane's fall was equally dramatic. Forced to sell her shares in our architectural firm back to me at below market value, she watched her career and reputation crumble in real time. The office space she and Marcus had leased for their new venture sat empty, an expensive monument to their failed conspiracy. The divorce decree was signed on a cold December afternoon, exactly 7 months after I'd filed the initial papers. As I walked out of the courthouse as a free woman, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: genuine peace. The man who had betrayed me would face the consequences of his choices, and I would move forward with my life and my business intact. That evening, my sister Janet flew in from California to celebrate with me. We ordered takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and opened a bottle of champagne I'd been saving for a special occasion. As we sat in my living room surrounded by the home I'd built and the life I'd protected, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's refusing to let someone else's betrayal destroy what you've worked to build. But the real healing was just beginning, and I had to learn who I was without the shadow of betrayal hanging over me. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I began the slow process of rebuilding not just my business, but my sense of self. The legal victory had been satisfying, but it hadn't erased the emotional damage of being betrayed by the two people I'd trusted most in the world. Recovery, I learned, was a more complex process than simply winning in court. I started seeing Dr. Sarah Martinez, a therapist who specialized in helping successful women navigate personal crises. Our sessions helped me understand that my workaholic tendencies, while contributing to my professional success, had also been a way of avoiding emotional vulnerability. I'd built walls around my heart that protected me from hurt, but also prevented genuine intimacy. The therapy wasn't easy. Dr. Martinez pushed me to examine my own role in the marriage's failure, not to assign blame, but to understand patterns that might affect future relationships. I had to acknowledge that while Marcus's betrayal was entirely his responsibility, my tendency to prioritize business over personal relationships had created distance between us. My business, freed from the distraction of a failing marriage, and the threat of legal dissolution, began to flourish in ways I hadn't expected. Without the constant stress of wondering what Marcus was doing or worrying about Diane's divided loyalties, I could focus completely on my projects and my clients. The sustainable housing development I'd been planning before the divorce became my passion project. Working with local nonprofits and community organizations, I designed affordable housing that incorporated green technology and created genuine community spaces. The project won several awards and attracted national attention to my firm. I also began reconnecting with old friends I'd neglected during my marriage troubles. College classmates, former colleagues, and industry contacts reached out after hearing about my divorce, and I realized how isolated I'd become. Building a social life outside of work relationships became a priority for the first time in years. My relationship with my sister Janet grew stronger through regular phone calls and visits. She helped me see that my parents' financial struggles had shaped my need for security in ways that sometimes interfered with my ability to trust and be vulnerable. Understanding these patterns didn't excuse Marcus's behavior, but it helped me make better choices going forward. Dating again was terrifying at first. The idea of trusting someone with my heart after such a complete betrayal seemed impossible. But Dr. Martinez encouraged me to take small steps to be open to connection while maintaining healthy boundaries. I met Thomas Anderson at a city planning meeting about affordable housing initiatives. He was an environmental lawyer who had spent his career fighting for sustainable development and community rights. Unlike Marcus, who had always seemed slightly intimidated by my success, Thomas was genuinely interested in my work and had built his own impressive career. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours, much like my first meeting with Marcus, but the dynamic was completely different. Thomas asked thoughtful questions about my projects, not because he wanted something from me, but because he was genuinely curious about sustainable development. He shared his own experiences fighting corporate polluters and working with community groups. What impressed me most about Thomas was his integrity. He'd turned down lucrative corporate positions to work for environmental nonprofits, prioritizing his values over financial gain. His apartment was modest, his car was practical, and his lifestyle reflected someone who measured success by impact rather than accumulation. We took things slowly, much more slowly than I had with Marcus. Thomas understood my need for caution and never pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable. We spent months getting to know each other as friends before our relationship became romantic. The contrast with my marriage was striking. Where Marcus had been charming but ultimately superficial, Thomas was thoughtful and authentic. Where Marcus had seen my success as something to exploit, Thomas saw it as something to admire and support. Where Marcus had hidden his true feelings and motivations, Thomas was refreshingly direct about his intentions and expectations. Learning to trust again required conscious effort every day. I had to resist the urge to investigate Thomas's activities or question his motives when he worked late or traveled for cases. Dr. Martinez helped me recognize the difference between reasonable caution and paranoid suspicion. The prenuptial agreement lesson became central to my new approach to relationships. I learned that protecting yourself legally isn't pessimistic or unromantic. It's practical, and smart. Love doesn't require financial vulnerability, and anyone who truly cares about you will understand your need for security. I began speaking to women's business organizations about protecting personal assets in marriage. My story resonated with female entrepreneurs who understood the challenges of building wealth while maintaining personal relationships. I shared practical advice about prenup separate business accounts and the importance of maintaining legal independence, even in loving partnerships. My mother's eventual understanding of what had happened with Marcus helped heal some of the family tension from the divorce. She called me one evening, almost a year after the court hearing, to apologize for not seeing through Marcus's charm. "I was so impressed by how he talked about supporting your dreams," she said. "I didn't realize he was really just planning to take half of them." The business continued growing, but I approached expansion differently than before. Instead of trying to do everything myself, I hired competent people and delegated responsibilities. I learned that building a sustainable business meant creating systems that didn't depend entirely on my personal involvement. I also established clearer boundaries between work and personal life. While I still worked hard and remained ambitious, I made time for relationships, hobbies, and experiences that weren't directly related to business success. I took painting classes, joined a book club, and started hiking regularly with Thomas. The final lesson I learned was about forgiveness, not for Marcus or Diane, but for myself. I had to stop blaming myself for trusting the wrong people and start celebrating my ability to build a life worth protecting. Their betrayal revealed their character, but my response revealed mine. A year after the divorce, I received a letter from Marcus. He'd found work teaching music at a community college in Wisconsin and was slowly paying off the judgment against him. The letter was an apology of sorts, acknowledging his mistakes and expressing regret for the pain he'd caused. I read it once and threw it away. His apology couldn't undo the damage, and I didn't need his validation to move forward. Thomas and I celebrated our first anniversary by taking a trip to New Zealand, where we hiked through national parks and talked about our hopes for the future. On our last night there, as we watched the sunset from a mountain overlooking Queenstown, I realized I'd learned something valuable from my ordeal. Sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you teaches you the most important lesson you needed to learn. Marcus's betrayal had forced me to examine my relationships, my priorities, and my definition of success. While I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone, I was grateful for the wisdom it had given me. I learned that the best revenge isn't getting even with people who hurt you. It's building a life so good, so authentic, and so fulfilling that their betrayal becomes irrelevant. Success isn't just about accumulating wealth or achieving professional recognition. It's about creating relationships based on trust, maintaining integrity under pressure, and having the courage to start over when necessary. Standing on that mountain with Thomas looking out over a landscape that seemed to stretch forever, I understood that I'd become stronger, not in spite of my struggles, but because of them. The woman who'd sat in that courtroom 18 months earlier, watching her marriage dissolve and her trust shatter, had emerged more confident, more discerning, and more capable of genuine love. The secret clause in my prenuptial agreement had saved my financial security, but the real protection had come from learning to value myself enough to demand honesty, integrity, and respect in all my relationships. That was a lesson worth more than any settlement could ever be. Have you ever had to learn the hard way that protecting yourself isn't selfish? It's necessary. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming betrayal and building authentic success. Share this with someone who might need to hear that it's possible to come back stronger from even the most devastating betrayals. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to let someone else's choices define your future. Here's to building lives worth protecting and relationships worth trusting.